we'll make a start. Good morning, good afternoon for those joining globally. Thank you so much for taking your time out to listen to Joe Lasort and myself today. Really appreciate you all taking the time. I say it's the second time of asking after some Zoom challenges last week, but we're in today, we're up and running, which is always a good place to start. The whole focus for today's session is about deploying global benefits technology and getting it right first time. So I guess quite an interesting subject. There's a lot for us to kind of cover and to go through. So we'll kind of get cracking whilst the last few people join the session. Please do ask as we go. We're keen to make it interactive. We've got a collective experience between Joe and myself, probably of upwards of 30, 40 years within the space. So genuinely happy to cover any questions. Please do put your thoughts in the Q&A section, and say we'll ask as we go. There may be a couple we might leave to the end as well, but please do ask as we continue through the session. In terms of the presenters, so for those who don't know me, my name is Luke Palman. I'm a Global Account Director at BenefX. I sit specifically within our international and global technology team, work with a number of existing customers and also new businesses in helping to define needs and requirements when it comes to the global benefits technology and a deployment of a system globally. I've been at BenefX just over 12 years, so I've seen a fair amount of transition to lots of organizations looking at technology globally. Also representing BenefX, I know we have some attendees from the US who might not be familiar with BenefX, but really we're a business solely focused on deploying and managing global benefit and reward solutions through our technology, live in over 80 different countries, 40 different languages, 30 plus different currencies, run through our system, and lots and lots of organizations utilizing our platform globally. Also delighted to be joined by Joe Lasort today from one of our newest partners in Sequoia Consulting. Joe, if I'm all right to hand over to yourself to intro yourself to everyone.
Absolutely, thank you, Luke. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Joe Lasort. I co-lead the Global Benefits Consulting practice at Sequoia Consulting. For those of you who don't know Sequoia, we're a US-based benefits HR compensation consulting firm. We've been around for about 25 years or so and specialize in benefits. We've got a couple of hundred clients for whom we manage their plans, everything from plan design, administration, brokerage, so on and so forth around the world. Delighted to have recently formed a partnership with BenefX, where for our clients, we do the plan design, the plan brokerage and consulting, and we partner with BenefX to apply their technology for our clients on a global basis. So I did look at the attendee list. We've got a number of our clients in the room today, as it were. Thanks for joining us. And with that as introduction, Luke, I think we can jump in.
Perfect. Thank you, Joe. Really appreciate it. And say delighted to have you on the call with me today, this afternoon, this morning. Really, we're going to center today's session around 7 key areas. This whole focus on how to ensure you get it right first time. We've seen the things that work, maybe the things that don't work quite so well, and this is what we'll be focusing on, these 7 different areas, kind of ranging from those organizations that might be considering deploying technology today for the first time, might be in the middle of a deployment, or may have implemented a couple of countries and are then looking to continue on that journey and roll out across additional countries. These are the 7 different areas that we'll be focusing today on. Starting off with point number 1 around developing an effective RFP. Joe, I know you in particular have significant expertise in running processes. Myself, I've been perhaps at the fortunate or unfortunate, depending which way you look at it, end of completing many an RFP in my time. But I guess what would be your view, kind of advice to anyone looking to embark on this for the first time and actually developing an RFP, and how that then leads to the success and deploying right first time?
Yeah, and obviously, Luke, the RFP and the RFP process are critical to positioning a client to getting it right the first time. The questions that are asked, the theory, the objectives that go into it. So if we can move to the next slide, we can talk about a bit of that. As background, for the last couple of years or so, Sequoia has run global benefits technology and admin RFPs for a number of our clients. A couple of those, the RFPs were essentially written by the client, others we've done ourselves. But in going through that process and having talked to clients over the last 5 or 6 years about this process. Some things have bubbled up as more important than others. And in fact, some things that don't get asked that probably should get asked. And we kind of have a hierarchy here, starting at the bottom. The first couple of rows there, these are the table stakes, if you were, the price of admission. And you want to ask in the RFP the potential providers about obvious things like, what are the languages in which your technology is available? If you're in 30 countries, you obviously want to make sure that it's available in the languages and in the currencies in those countries. Some obvious questions about the technology itself. What are the broad deliverables that the technology provides? To what extent does it take work off your plate? And a good understanding of what you're doing in the admin space as the client that you'd like to pass on to the provider is helpful there. Some obvious other sort of price of admission stuff. Security. I mean, obviously information security is paramount these days, and understanding the extent to which and how and according to what pedigree the provider is able to demonstrate their security, their infrastructure, their expertise around all of that. Questions about other clients to whom they provide their service. So, from a benchmarking point of view, most of us who are in this space like to look to companies like ourselves in terms of how we design plans. But if you're looking at 4 or 5 providers, the ability that they have and the experience they can demonstrate with others in your space is pretty important as well. And I think if we've looked at RFPs over the last several years, that foundational stuff tends to be present in all of them. As you then come up the hierarchy, you begin to get into the areas that are more specifically important to the individual client. So customer references, again, understanding the extent to which the provider works with clients who are like you or important to you. What partnerships do the providers have to be able to get you services that are outside their areas of expertise? So one that we hear a lot about these days is leave administration. And often we'll see an RFP come through for benefits administration globally with questions about leave administration. Well, most of the benefits admin providers don't do leave administration. But if they have partners with whom they work who do, and they can integrate with those partners, that may be in their favor as you evaluate who you want to work with. Integration expertise, which of the HR systems around the world do they work with? There are 2 or 3 very prominent providers of HR systems, but there are others that are also good and not so prominent. What experience do the potential providers have with the HR systems that you use? What's the availability of data? So, Global Ben Admin is about processing leavers and joiners and providing total reward statements and getting work off of your plate from an administrative point of view. But in order to do that, they need data. The provider needs data. To what extent do they feed that data back to you in terms of analytics around who's using the plans, who's signing up the plans, and who's not? And we think that's important. The ability to process the data and who's using it and get that data out of their systems and back into yours is critical. And questions around that we think are really useful. Administration, and while it seems obvious, some of the providers in this space are very happy as part of their service to literally do the administration for you. There are others in this space who only want to license software. Now that can take some work off your plate, but if they're also willing to literally do the administrative work, that can take more work off your plate. So understanding the capabilities and the appetite that these providers have for doing the admin, in addition to merely licensing software, we think is really helpful as well. We would suggest that you ask deep and critical questions about employee support. As we talk to our clients, particularly with regard to small countries, many of our clients in large countries have large HR critical mass who can deal with employee queries. In small countries, they may be doing that centrally at the headquarters. The extent to which the selected provider can actually provide that support, answer employee questions, track problems, get back to employees is really important. There are wide differences between the providers in this space about their ability to provide communication support, right? At the most fundamental level, that's about branding websites so that it looks and feels like yours, right? A common look and feel across countries. But at the more complex level, it's about allowing you to communicate to employees through the selected tool, right? To what extent can you identify specific groups of employees and use the selected tool to communicate with them about benefit issues that are unique to them on a country-specific basis, on a demographic-specific basis, so on and so forth. Another important question at this level is about the relationships that the selected provider or the providers under consideration have with the broking community. So many of you out there who are going down this road have relationships with global brokers. You certainly have relationships at the local country level with local brokers. What's the state of play among the providers under consideration with the brokers that you're currently using? Are they agnostic in terms of which brokers you use? Some of the providers in this space may require that you change your brokers in certain countries in order to make their system available to you. That may be desirable in some cases, but maybe not in others. So clear questioning of the providers around which brokers they work with and how they work with them, and understanding how that plays out with the work you need to do to implement, we think is really, really important. And then at the top level on this hierarchy, these are the things that we at Sequoia have seen in RFPs that don't necessarily show up in the questioning that we really think should. So one is about scalability. And again, many of you probably have certain countries with large populations and others with very small populations. And those are not static numbers, right? Certain populations will grow. You may have 30 people in a country today and 300 3 years from now. So the ability of the selected provider, let's say starting at the small end, to provide a useful, globally consistent solution to a small group, but also be able to grow that and step up through levels of robustness, if you will, as that group grows. And that scalability on an individual country basis is really important. And it is really a point of a differentiation among the providers. What's the focus of the selected providers in terms of countries where they plan to grow, the sectors that they intend to serve, the improvements and developments to their system that they're likely to implement? To what extent are they listening to their clients to implement changes and improvements to their solution? And what roadmaps have they put together so that as you look at your rollout and your 3 to 5 year plan, how is that consistent with where they're going as an organization? I have to say, Luke, that one of the more important questions that doesn't get asked is around capacity. And this is a field there aren't 100 providers in this space. There's a limited number. And the willingness of the client or the provider to take on a client of your size, their capacity, in particular, when will they be able to take on you as a client and at what pace, given their capacity, is really important. Broker agnosticity, I'm not sure that's a word, but it's not underlined here, so I'm going to assume that it is a word. But their ability to work with your brokers. And I think the last one may be the most important. It may be obvious to some, but the way this gets worded in the RFP is really important. Our experience at Sequoia, as we've evaluated the providers in this space, is that broadly speaking, price is not a significant differentiator. In most of the RFPs that we've seen run for like services, the prices are not 50, 60% apart from one another at the high end and the low end. But it's really important to understand what's included, what's not included. And we use the term hidden cost here, but I think what we're really trying to say is being able to summarize the bids that you get in the RFP process in a way that gets closest to apples is really important, because certain costs with some providers are included in the raw fees that you'll see and others are not. And being able to standardize that expression of cost in a way that really allows you to look at value for spend is really, really important. And Luke, you may have some comments on that as well. But I guess what we're saying here is, beyond the price of admission and the things that are important to you, it's very important to think about some of these more broad issues that we've seen as we've looked at several RFPs to get to the right ability to make decisions quickly. And obviously, if you run an RFP in this space, there's a bit of an iterative process as well, right? You're going to get bids from certain providers. You're going to go back and forth to them with questions. And that standardization emerges as you go through that iterative process. But again, in the sense of, and with the spirit of getting it right the first time, engineering that into the initial RFP, we think is really helpful. So I'm going to stop there. Luke, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I think you're completely right, Joe. I know we've spoken about this before, but I think it is that piece of the top which actually can make or break the success of the scheme. I think this, very nicely articulates that yes, there's going to be things you will want to ask everyone. There'll be some standard things you will need to look to get a gauge on, make sure that the organizations that you're going to RFP with are going to be fit for purpose. But actually, it's that top row that really can make or break the success of the scheme and your ability to get it right first time. If you've got a date in mind that you say we need a system in place by this specific date for reasons, well, I'm with a renewal or because you've got other technology that you're switching off, and actually that piece around capacity doesn't come up until you've signed the contract and you're in implementation, and then you're stuck because you need to hit those dates.
Yeah,
actually, it's really, really important to understand those things, and they're often the things that are almost kind of forgotten during an RFP process, and we probably don't see asked of us as much as arguably they potentially should be.
Yeah, and I think just one other point on this, scalability tends to be discussed in terms of getting bigger, right? You have 30 people in a client, and if you're in a country, and if you're successful, you're going to grow. The reality these days is that certain clients are contracting in certain countries, or perhaps even curtailing operations in a country. So I think while this often surfaces in contracting, we think it's useful to have a discussion with the potential providers early on at this stage of the RFP process. Here's our current populations in countries, but what happens if one or two of these go away, or if these numbers scale on the downside, just to make sure you understand how their pricing may be impacted and how contracting may be impacted.
Yeah, great. Well, and I guess how flexible they are in terms of forming a true partnership. I guess that's kind of point one covered. I guess kind of point two, and I know this is something that yourselves and the team at Sequoia undertake a lot of, but actually try and setting the right foundations for success, actually with the benefit plans in situ, availability of data. I guess setting the right foundations. I'm going to bring a couple of these up actually, Joe, and we'll kind of get your view on a couple of these. But I know something you would always suggest for someone, having an inventory of current plans, utilizing the relationships that you currently have. I guess, can you perhaps maybe bring a couple of examples of maybe of both actually to life for everyone on the call?
Yeah, this is interesting, Luke, because obviously, if you're going to evaluate potential partners for a technology deployment globally, it makes a lot of sense to have an understanding of where you have people in what numbers and what those plans actually look like. And I think most of the clients that we encounter have at least a fundamental understanding, and they can produce a listing of countries with current headcount. But it's important to understand in those countries the difference between full-time employees and contractors, for example, who aren't necessarily covered by the plans. Or we'll often encounter a scenario where in 3 or 4 countries, they aren't technically the client's employees at all. They're on a PEO or an EOR who are providing the benefits, and then literally outside the scope of what can be deployed. So certain HR systems, you can press a button and you get that inventory of populations. Others, it takes some work, but I think it makes sense to do that homework ahead of time if you can do it. And perhaps more importantly is understanding what plans are in place, and more than a rudimentary understanding of what those plans look like. And I think you'll find, as you go down the road with potential providers, that the complexity required to administer a plan in a country and the costs that are commensurate with that complexity depend on the nature of the plans. At the most basic level is their choice making, right? If it's a country where you've got 3 sets of benefits, there is no choice making, they're not transactional, everyone gets them. That's a more simple solution than a country with 8 benefits, 5 of which are transactional, and 3 of which have fairly significant flexibility. So a listing that says in this country we have life and medical and dental and a retirement plan, that's helpful. But a little more of the detail around those plans allows the providers to quote more accurately from the onset, and that gives you a better understanding of how they can actually help you. And I think that leads to the second box on the page here. Where does that data reside? So if you've got a relationship with a global broker or a global coordinator who's managing all of this for you, almost by definition, they should have that information. And they should be able to press a button and produce most of that. And I think for most of the clients where we've run RFPs, that's been the case. If you're not using a global broker, and if you have individual brokerage relationships in each country, you have to lean on the local brokers a little more to get this. But I think we would suggest that a discussion with those brokers and as thorough a summary as you can muster before the RFP goes out about where you have people in a country, and then for each country, that detail on the plans really helps. And I mean, frankly, the brokers are getting paid a commission. Part of their job is to keep track of this. They ought to be able to feed that back to you in a way that supports this. And I guess I'd add to that, there are so many organizations doing these RFPs these days that the global brokers have seen enough of these scenarios where they shouldn't have to invent the wheel to make that data available to you. So not sure what your observations are there, Luke, but that's what I would stress.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's, we know most organizations will have a consultant, a broker, or local brokers in situ. Use those partners as you can. It's going to make your life a lot easier as you go through the RFP process and the implementation to have some of that data, or as much of that data available.
Yeah.
Part of it also, I think, actually leads on to timescales as well. When are those plans going to renew? And actually some of that will then determine when the right time for you to deploy the technology in a specific country is. It all kind of feeds off one thing. When you have that data, you can make the right decisions for when each country then goes live for you and for your specific countries.
Yep.
Or even actually say, do we now need to look to align dates? For me, this is a great example of when we look to deploy in a specific country, typically you take 6 months. There's various steps you go through, designing your technology, designing your plans, looking to go live to enable choice, and then the actual drop dead benefit selection date you can kind of see on the last part here. It's a 6-month process, but actually it doesn't make sense for you to go live 2 months before a renewal date. If all your benefits renew in January and you're going live in April, if all your benefits go live in April and you're going live in January, actually you probably will end up duplicating a whole host of work. So make your own life easier, and it all comes with having the right access to that data from the off. I know duplication actually probably touches on almost kind of point 2 as well, Joe. We were chatting about this only yesterday.
Yeah, and before I dig into duplication, just a bit more on timelines. I think it's important to have a realistic perspective here, because no one can predict the future. So it's pretty easy to say, here's what our renewals are over the next year. What's less easy to say is, this is what I'm going to get the email from the CEO that says, we're adding a new country and that's critical, which can actually throw a timeline into a bit of a state of disarray. And things like, acquisitions, they're not predictable and they may impact the timeline, but understanding renewals and the organization's current strategic plans around growth and expansion globally are really, really key from a timeline point of view. I think duplication, I think the key issue there is, in many countries, you're going to have relationships with current brokers who are already doing some of the elements of administration. And what we don't want to do is get you to a place where the cost of that administration that the broker is doing is paid for by the commissions they're getting. And then you're having a provider of the Ben admin solution duplicating that. So understanding from an admin point of view what your brokers and other current third parties are doing, so that that can be integrated, and the chosen provider may augment what they're doing, they may replace what they're doing, or you may just keep it completely the way it is. But the bottom line is having a view towards pricing, so that if the chosen solution replaces a lot of what the broker's doing in a country, you want to see if you can reduce commissions or that broker's fees to accommodate for the fact that they're not doing that work anymore. Conversely, if what your global admin provider is quoting for a country replicates what the broker's doing and you choose to keep it with the broker, you want to make sure that that's reflected in the provider's fees as well, so that you're not being charged twice. And I think of everything that we've seen clients look at in RFPs and the selection process, this probably gets the least attention. And it does surface at the end, sometimes when you're in the middle of contracting. And we just think it's better to think about this early on.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think it probably also links back to timescales. So if you have a contract with a broker and it runs for a specific point in time and you're locked in with that service, then actually maybe it does make sense to go live with that country at the point in which the natural change time for that relationship occurs. There's no right or wrong way. I think, again, that kind of that point around there not being no right or wrong way, also for me actually goes into the whole deployment, the whole piece of technology, the whole system implementation as well. And that's setting the right foundations is also about setting the right foundations to grow. There's no right or wrong way, but our suggestion would always be, don't feel like you have to solve absolutely everything from day one. You know, the whole concept of this session is how do you make sure you get it right first time? Well, actually, probably the biggest piece is thinking you don't have to solve everything everywhere and meet every single objective absolutely from day one. The most successful clients have looked to deploy maybe a couple of countries at a time, get the benefit solutions, you know, managed, implemented, the integrations with vendors, with your HR system, with payroll implemented, and from there build out to other solutions, maybe build out to total reward statements or reimbursements or communications, or even now having that platform to add additional benefit plans or employee funded benefits. You don't feel like you have to solve absolutely everything from day one, because sometimes you might be then biting off more than you can chew and actually don't end up with the outcome that you want. So arguably for me, this is probably one of the biggest takeaways for anyone on the call is don't feel like you have to solve absolutely everything everywhere from day one. Think about it as a gradual evolution, and that when you have a platform that will then enable you to do those slightly more strategic things, but that doesn't have to be from day one. Could be in years 2, could be in years 3. Whilst we've covered those 2 initial pieces, I think the next 2 are probably quite closely linked. I think setting objectives is always fundamental, very, very important. But I think defining those objectives early on during that RFP stage enables you to ensure that at all times you're looking to secure and procure the right type of solution that's actually going to meet your objectives. You can then think about how they change year on year, back to that point about not solving everything from day one. To begin with, your objective might be around reducing administration. But now you've then solved that problem with administration, that might then enable you to tackle multinational pooling or global underwriting or some of the more strategic things that you want to. But it's not until you meet those initial objectives, reduce that administration, take the day-to-day admin off your hands, that you can then do those slightly more strategic aspects. So I think it's really important you understand what those initial objectives are, set them as very, very clear with any initial RFP, and continue to measure against them as you deploy in other countries. And here's some examples, some of the typical objectives that the customers have. I guess, you know, from your time running various processes, I guess any of these particularly jump out for you, Joe?
No, I think we see all of these. I mean, I think most of the clients we've talked to, getting more value from the plan makes sense. And I think from the plans makes sense. And I think they understand that there's a cost associated with this kind of a deployment, but being able to, as one of the objectives, be able to say the return on that investment, both quantitatively and non-quantitatively, will justify that. And I also think the key objectives vary a bit based on the nature of the client, right? So we at Sequoia have some clients who are relatively small. They may be in 10 countries. They may not have a country with more than 50 employees. As I think I said earlier, in that case, often things as rudimentary as processing levers and joiners are being done centrally at the headquarters because they don't have anyone in the country to do that. And the biggest objective they have is to get that admin off of their desk and get it to someone who can systematize it and do it more efficiently. We also have some clients who are very large, and they've got 40 or 50,000 employees in 20 or 30 countries. In that case, they've got critical mass from an HR perspective at the local level. And the objectives are less about taking work off corporate's plate. It's more about the employee experience and making sure that as a lever leaves or as a joiner joins, it's not the headache at corporate anymore. It's the experience that that employee has as he or she comes in or goes out in a way that speaks to the employment brand and the reputation that the client has in the market. Communication is common to most of our clients. I think as an example, most clients understand that if you're using a global benefits admin technology tool, because it has the data and can manipulate the data, it's not a huge leap from that to being able to communicate. And that could be total reward statements. It could be general information about the plans. It could be messaging things about the organization. It could be about well-being, but that's quite common as well. So I think we see all of these. And I think in a sense, Luke, similarly to the RFP issues we talked about earlier, many of those I think apply to all clients, but some of these will only apply to some. I would say that for all clients, thinking through these and then what other specific objectives they have, and talking about that and factoring that into even at the RFP level makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, completely agree. I think they're very much linked. I guess same for me, even in terms of the actual physical solution that a customer ends up with, is always going to be linked to what their initial objectives were. Now, to put that, make that kind of real, at Benefits, we see our benefits module being used in one of kind of 4 different ways. In some aspects, for some customers, it's very, very simple. It's more of a place to manage information, policy documents, claims forms, who a provider is, what plans they'll have access to in a specific country. In other countries and other customers, they're looking for us to solve the challenges around actually how do I manage and add dependence to a medical plan, because that takes up a host of our time and compliance issues, and that's our focus. Whereas in other countries, people are using our technology to fully manage that end-to-end joining process around benefits, to manage any complexity, any flexibility, any choice, any employee-funded benefits all through one system. And we call this kind of simple to complex kind of methodology that we have, which means pretty much any one of your countries is going to fit into one of these 4 categories. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's the objectives that define where the right place for that country to sit is. So if actually your objective is more around communication, actually you might have a number of countries that are at that more simple end, because to begin with, it's just how do we get everything in one place and better communicate to your employees. Whereas actually, if your objective is on reducing administration, reducing queries that come through to your teams, automating those processes that today are manual for the joining and leaving of benefits, well, actually going to be more at that slightly complex end of the spectrum where all of that process is automated. And I think it's really, really fundamental that's why once you've locked down your objectives, that can help give you that guidance as to, okay, where's the right approach for each of our countries to sit, and ultimately where we're going to drive our return on investment from, and how we're going to then prove that return on investment once we're live. So it's about getting it right first time. Once you're live, actually, how do we then prove the return on investment that we've achieved? And that only comes from having those objectives fully and clearly defined to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, Luke, another issue here is, and I guess it leads into the next couple of slides, is some of the thinking that we would encourage you to do is around what's going to apply globally and what's going to be country specific, right? And from an efficiency point of view, there will be certain things. So for example, the look and feel of the site that you deploy in each country, you want it to look and feel the same, even though it may have different levels of functionality given the complexity of the benefits in a given country. But what are the things that you as the client want to apply globally? Get that right the first time, so that as you roll out the individual countries, which may be in 3 or 4 waves over a number of countries, that global deployment is looking and feeling the same, and understanding how that's different from what's going to be different country to country, based on the complexity, the nature of the benefits, the regulatory environment, your relationship with your broker in that country, et cetera. So, Luke, you may want to talk a bit about your experience with helping clients get that global discussion happening at the onset.
Yeah, it's a really, really good point. And I think for me, it's one of the most fundamental changes that benefits we've actually made to our implementation process over the last couple of years is, and again, if we think about the subject of today's session, yes, it's about how do we get it right first time, but it's also how do we get it right for you, the reward, the benefit leaders at your businesses. You're busy, you have lots and lots on your plate, more and more being thrown onto your plate all the time. So how do we make sure it's as an efficient deployment as possible is something that we come up with time and time again. And for us, we've implemented this methodology which we call global program initiation. And exactly to your point, Joe, it's to begin with, before you even focus on deploying any of your individual countries, an easy thing to do when you're looking to deploy a solution and you're focusing on that end goal where everything's live, and that might be your focus for how do we get it right, how do we get it live. Actually, take that step back and go, how do we do this as an efficient way possible? It's about defining those things that are globally consistent and doing that once. And then also defining that process for the things that are going to be different from country to country, like payroll interfaces. Payroll will be different in every single country, but let's define the process for how we're going to arrive on what payroll looks like in each country, who we're going to involve, who we're going to need, when do we involve them in the program, that will actually make your life so much easier at a later date. So we deployed this whole process. We call it global program initiation. Think of it as a mini 2 to 4 week project. The first steps that you would do once you've had everything signed off, you've chosen your provider, you're into implementation mode. And there's a number of different areas that can form global program initiation, from your HR interface through to your payroll approach, through to your approach for global mobility and what happens when people move from country to country. Actually get all of these aspects defined once. You can then, when you're then looking to deploy in other countries, just focus on those country differences. And it's a much, much more effective way than going, okay, now let's focus on Spain. Great, Spain's done. Now let's focus on China. Now let's focus on Brazil. Actually, you can almost kind of be part way to implementing in every single country by doing this approach. And this is certainly something that we would definitely suggest. And to be fair, actually, probably really relevant to the question that's just been asked. What's your biggest piece of advice to someone considering technology? I think it's once you have decided who you want, who you want to use, where you want to deploy, make sure you do these things and you do these things once. Otherwise, back to your point on duplication, you'll be duplicating a whole host of effort and ultimately adding time and cost and resource to an implementation.
Luke, I'll just chip in. I have an answer to that question as well. We're essentially, this entire presentation today is about advice for those who are considering this, but I think the biggest piece of advice I would give is to find 3 or 4 of your peers who've been down this road before and have implemented, and talk to them about the process, not only the RFP process and how you assess providers, but what implementation looks like, what costs look like, what their ROI has been, because I think learning from what they've been through will help inform the process that you go through. And I think pricing is a good example of this. We can give you lots of examples of 2 clients, relatively the same size, relatively the same geographic spread, relatively the same objectives for deploying technology. And one looked at the fees and said, oh my God, that's just outrageous. There's no way we can afford that. And others looked at the fees and breathed a sigh of relief saying, well, I thought it was going to be a lot more than that. So, I mean, there are lots of other dimensions on which I think a realistic perspective serves going down this road, and talking to some of those clients who've done that, I think can really, really inform that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think equally in terms of the amount of genuine time, resource, some of their learnings. I think for me, one of the learnings that always seems to come up is making sure you allow yourself enough time to implement. It's something that comes up time and time again. So I think you're absolutely right. Get that advice from your peers in industry and in other industries as well. What you will find though with this kind of approach to global program initiation is actually, before you then do get stuck into the detail of a country, you might be doing this mini project. Here's just an example of a program plan, go live across a number of different countries over pretty much a 12-month period. And actually by doing this piece, we call it global program initiation, it might mean that actually your first countries go live a little bit later than if you were just to focus on that specific country. But what it then means is those countries 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and onwards actually go live a lot quicker. So kind of phase 1 might be a bit longer, but the subsequent phases are much quicker. By having this approach, looking at those aspects that are globally consistent, defining a process for how you will agree those locally specific elements, very, very important piece of a global rollout. We're now onto the final 2. We've got 5 minutes to go, and we're bang on time. So we're really just to cover off these final 2 points, and again they're actually quite linked. So about having the right team internally, and then also kind of the right team or the right partner externally. So Joe, again, I'll kind of bring these up, kind of some of the various stakeholders that we see. Again, you've seen what works, what doesn't work in this space, but with engaging with your stakeholders.
Yeah, and I think internally, giving some thorough thought to who the internal stakeholders on the client side might be is really important. And many of them are up here, right? It's IT, it's security, it's finance, it's HR. It could even be the senior C-suite, depending on the expenditure that's involved here. But we've seen clients who bring a full complement of key internal stakeholders to the first meeting or in the first drafting of the RFP. And then those where their continual or constant involvement isn't necessary, fall out throughout the process and come back in at the decision-making stage. We've seen other clients who don't involve anyone, and then you get far down the road, and then you realize, well, wait a minute, IT security is going to need to see this, or the CFO is going to need to see this. I would counsel that erring on the side of involving more internal stakeholders is better than fewer, because people can always fall out if they need to, but it's difficult sometimes and could put a project behind schedule pretty quickly if you need to bring people in at the end of the day who haven't been part of the process. And I think the key players are listed here pretty comprehensively.
Yeah, I agree. I think one which often is perhaps underutilized early doors would be procurement. So I think something I've personally seen in my time at Benefex, where you almost you go through a number of the steps that we've been through and we've talked about today. So you've defined your objectives, you look to get pricing, you then look to understand what are your delivery timeline might be. You go to the business and go, okay, this is who we want to use, and then procurement go, well, have you done your due diligence? Who else have you seen? Who else have you explored? And you go, oh, actually, no one. And then there's an RFP process, and it's another 6 months before you're in that position where you can start to kick off that process. So I think involving procurement, particularly early, I think for me is a real fundamental.
Yeah, and along those lines, one approach that we've seen yield success, particularly after you've shortlisted providers, right? And you're looking at maybe two. There's the dreaded finalist meeting, right? Well, what we've seen happen effectively is the client has 2 and maybe 3 finalist meetings. One is with the HR infrastructure team. The second is with IT and security. The third might be with finance, because the questions that those constituencies are going to ask are different from one another. Mm-hmm. And rather than have a discussion bounce around from area to area, 2 or maybe 3 meetings that focus on specific areas may be more useful. And it sounds like a lot of meetings. No one wants meetings for the sake of meetings. But I think if you can focus in particular, the finalist evaluation meetings in various areas and get them done efficiently and then sort of pull it together at the end, we've seen that work really effectively for certain clients.
And yeah, 100%. And we've got a lot of different kind of stakeholders, names, areas up on this screen. Actually, in certain situations, it might only be one person that you do need to go and speak with, and a half an hour call, and you can then put a tick against IT, InfoSec, data protection, payroll and HR interfaces, and actually you've got one person that kind of has many hats perhaps, and you can cover a number of these different areas at once. So yeah. Actually this, A, is not exhaustive, but also it might mean you only need to speak to 2 or 3 other people, and you yourselves on the call might be the ones who's responsible for reward, benefits, pension, retirement, stock, well-being. I'm sure there's probably a number of you that can resonate with that, and actually all of those areas sit under you. So this will vary from organization to organization, and often depending on size. Typically the bigger the business, the more specialized people are, and therefore the more potential conversations you need to speak with. We were speaking with a new customer last week, and they had to have 17 separate stakeholder meetings to get the kind of approval to move forward with the project. But that's probably the extreme end, and actually it might only be sort of 2 or 3 that you need to have. I think whilst it's then fundamentally important that you have the right internal stakeholders and the right internal team lined up to support you throughout this process, and no doubt early involvement with these stakeholders will absolutely enable success and you to get it right first time. I think we'd probably be remiss of us to also not suggest that a fundamental part is also having the right partners. And I thought we'd actually end the session with some of our favorite partners. Joe, you being based in Philadelphia, I have no doubt Ant and Dec are probably your favorite of all the partnerships that we've put up on screen here. But for me, it's slightly cliche, but actually it genuinely is about getting the right partners, the right partners to work with you in those early days of the conversation, shaping what the requirements are, helping you define your objectives, helping you and working with you to define what the right country approach, the right phased approach is, supporting you with all of these conversations. Don't feel like you have to navigate all of these yourselves. If you find the right partner, they will have a whole host of information. They've been through this before. I can speak about my time at Benefex, and it's not the most exciting stuff, but there's a whole pack of information, security, data protection initiatives, questions that we have answered that are there and good to go. So don't feel like you have to create all of this yourselves and navigate all of these conversations. The right partners will work with you to give you everything that you need. I think it's slightly cliche, but but actually finding the right partners is hugely, hugely important.
Really important. And I'll just say that I think Luke threatened to put a fifth picture on the slide of Luke and me representing the Sequoia Benefits Partnership. I'm really glad you didn't do that. But
that's it. But to be fair, I mean, we probably would go with finish off with perhaps a little bit of a shameless plug. But we have started this partnership exactly for this reason. We talk about some of the fundamental things at the beginning, and actually this is where Sequoia are amazing, setting the right foundations, ensuring that you have the right support right the way throughout your process, whether it's understanding the relevant planned information, whether it's understanding actually which areas of your local brokers might you not need going forward when it comes to technology. People like yourself, Joe, who've run various RFP processes and are there as a sort of a helping hand. I've certainly seen it firsthand, the support that you would bring to an organization. And to be fair, we're probably the same. We will work with any organization to help define objectives, work through that budget and scope, and then with one eye on that, what does implementation genuinely mean? It really is for me about having the right partnerships, and it's one of the reasons why we went into partnership together, was that synergy and alignment.
Yeah, we are also delighted about the partnership with Benefex, and just as a point of clarity, Sequoia is no longer doing RFPs for clients because of the partnership. We value the partnership so much that, and we're not going to be evaluating other providers. We're here to talk about Benefex and how we work together. So we hope the audience appreciates that.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I appreciate we're actually 3 minutes over the initial 45 minutes. I think it's pretty good going. We've had a fair amount of content to cover. Probably just that last opportunity to ask anyone if there's any other further questions, any other clarifications, and we'll happily move on. I guess one has been raised immediately. That was kind of anything to specifically avoid. I guess I have my view, but Joe, perhaps I'll hand that one over to you in terms of anything specifically to avoid. What perhaps you've seen not quite work so well.
Well, I guess one thing comes immediately to mind, and that's making a decision based on price, because of the complexity of the nature of the solution. And as we said earlier, because of the differences, in some cases, complex differences in which the various providers state their pricing, a discussion around price with the vendor is with the multiple vendors, I think, is a lot more useful than a quick decision based on price. And then I guess the other thing is, I would avoid the assumption that this can be done quickly. And Luke, I think you talked about this a little bit earlier. The evaluation process takes time and the implementation process takes time. So I would avoid an unrealistic perspective on how quickly this can be done. It is an investment in time and resources, but it's one that we think can pay off.
And I agree. I completely agree, Joe. And I think for me, probably the only other thing to avoid, it sound perhaps a little bit like a broken record, but it is that sort of perception that you have to do absolutely everything everywhere from the beginning, even in terms of when you're going to request budget. Actually, if you can cover 92% of a population, we're only covering 15 of your, say, 30 countries, actually you're going to get a much stronger return on investment for that deployment than saying, actually, this is going to be our focus, and we'll then look to potentially deploy to other countries at a point in time in the future. I think that's certainly something that I've seen, that sometimes for those countries that have very low headcount, actually the cost to implement might be not too dissimilar to a country with 5 employees to 100 employees. So actually, just by focusing on those countries, often with greater headcount, means you can cover more of the population actually in a slightly more efficient way. So I think that piece around don't think you have to do everything all at once everywhere is certainly kind of probably the one thing that I would suggest that people avoid.
Yep.
I think that's everything for questions. Just another one come through, but we'll come back to that person individually after the session. Thank you all so much for joining. I guess it was just the final piece to say, both Joe and myself are both on LinkedIn, available over email, happy to offer any additional support, guidance, learnings, go through any specific examples with anyone on the call or watching back afterwards. The other thing to flag is that everyone who's signed up to the webinar will receive early access to a report which will be coming out, I think either later this week or early next. We had to put it back a few days after some of the Zoom challenges last week. So Do keep an eye out for that. You'll get early access to it. And this is really just putting a little bit more meat around what we've discussed today and focusing on a couple of these areas in more detail. Joe, thank you so much for joining, for offering your expertise and guidance to everyone on the call. Really, really do appreciate it.
Happy to be part of it, Luke, and thanks to everyone for attending.
Excellent. Take care. Thanks a lot.